Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
Nixon's Secrets is our topic, with our friend Roger Stone making another appearance here on Florida Roundtable.
Brand new book, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. And that's an awful lot to get into 1 hour. But we're going to give it our best shot. We certainly will. We'll invite you to put an ear on the radio. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political commentator Al Spry. Yes, that's TUFF TV 38, available over the air with an HD antenna, which are very low cost to buy. You can actually pull us right off the air. Also, we are available in select communities through cable, through the Summit Broadband cable system. And if you can't get Tuff TV, you should ask your cable or satellite provider to gift you some Tuff TV. We're on there Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sunday mornings at 9, right?
Yeah, I like it,
So the winner and the loser of politics this week, the winner is Bill Clinton. He's stumping for Roger Christ last
Charlie
week.
Crist.
Did I say Roger Christ?
Yeah.
Oh, Roger Stone, Charlie Crist. His stumping for Charlie in Miami last week served as a reminder there's probably no more popular national Democrat in Florida and no other figure that every Florida Democrat would love to campaign alongside. Sorry, Obama. The loser of the week, Steve Sutherland. A fundraising invite advised people to, quote, leave the missus at home.
What?
Hey, Congressman, the 19th century called, and it can use your help tamping down that pesky new suffrage movement. But also Pam Bondi, Reagan, our Attorney General, who we've had on the show, says she has many, many gay friends. Really? As you know, she's leading the effort to keep the anti-gay marriage amendment alive in Florida from being struck down as unconstitutional, even though that's where the tendency and I think the law is. But she appeared on Political Connections Sunday in Tampa. She discussed everything from fake marijuana to her joining a lawsuit over pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. And then they talked about Florida's gay marriage ban. It has nothing to do with her personal views, she says. She said, quote, I have many, many gay friends, unquote, and suggested one of her legal briefs on the matter might have been better worded. Quote, I can tell you now I'm reading every word of every brief that's being written. It's kind of like the anti-Semite who says, I have a lot of Jewish friends.
Yeah.
Or the person who doesn't like black people who says, boy, I have a lot of black friends. It just it comes off as that same kind. I'm not saying it is. It just has that same kind of ring to it.
That way, doesn't it?
Whenever you have to defend yourself, that you have a certain amount of friends of a certain ethnic or socioeconomic or religious or sexual connotation, I think you have something to hide. I think you've made one step towards where people go, yeah, I know what you're all about. I have lots of friends. But wait, no.
You make a very fair assessment there, Al, I think. Hey, I wanted to mention that our junior U.S. Senator, Republican Marco Rubio, was a guest last week on Face the Nation.
I watched that.
The opening guest. Well, I did too. And towards the end of the interview, he said he was measuring his words very carefully and had given it a lot of thought. But then when it comes to foreign policy, that this president does not know what he's doing. And I have a feeling that, we haven't got a policy on Syria yet. Probably got a lot of support for the senator, at least on foreign policy, as far as that goes. Schieffer did ask him, too, about a possible run in 2016, and, of course, he's very evasive about that.
Yeah, but he's going to run. You know he is, and I know, too. Chris Christie, let's talk a little bit about the 2016 race. Chris Christie has an image problem in Florida. The governor of New Jersey is at the bottom of a list of would-be contenders for the GOP. We have have 46 degrees. Lower than Kentucky Senator Rand Paul at 51, Marco Rubio's at 65, and former Governor Jeb Bush of Florida 68. One person, a Republican for Key West, said he'd like to see a Jeb Bush Condoleezza Rice ticket.
Interesting.
But let's not count Marco out. Marco is a hell of a campaigner, and he's a quite an astute politician.
I suspect at his young age he might rather be angling for a vice presidential nomination, knowing that even if they would lose, that he could still come back later on, just like Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, I think he'll run for the presidency and then take a vice presidential slot with whoever wins the GOP nomination. That's my guess.
Let us pause along the network line here. We'll remind you that you are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll continue our conversation in a moment. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, at this point in the program, we are off to Fort Lauderdale, where we are joined by Roger Stone, a politician extraordinaire, a part-time historian, political raconteur. I think that's a word you like to use. And Roger, this is a return visit. Roger, it's very nice to have you back with us on the Florida Roundtable.
Great to be here.
Well, the occasion of this visit is your brand new book entitled Nixon's Secrets: The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. And let me just say right up front, you were the youngest member of the staff on the committee to re-elect the president in 1972. So you know whereof you speak. You were with this man for many years firsthand.
Yeah, although in all honesty, I did not really get to know him on an intimate basis until his post-presidential years. By then, I had gone to work for Ronald Reagan in 3 national campaigns, 76, 80, and 84. And then in the late 70s, when I was elected young Republican national chairman, President Nixon invited me to San Clemente, and what was supposed to be a 15-minute, perfunctory grip and grin became a 4-hour discussion of politics. And
wow.
I then went to work for him in his post-presidential years, vetting invitations, passing messages, and doing a lot of fundamental legwork. So, I got to spend a lot of time with the former president, and I think, therefore, I have a more balanced view of many of the contemporary historians. On this very recent 40th anniversary of his resignation, it was hard to find anybody who had anything good to say about him, but I had a lot of good things to say about him.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you had to describe him in a sentence, because, obviously he's quite an enigmatic figure, the most enigmatic president in recent memory. Well, how would you describe Nixon's, the crux of who he was?
That's very difficult because it's a paradox. In other words, he is both brilliant and obtuse. He is both bold and hesitant. He is both paranoid and confident. He's both, visionary and petty. I mean, this is why he's so endlessly fascinating for historians and still for the American people. Many years after his death, he's a walking contradiction. He makes enormous mistakes, but he also achieves enormous things for the country.
But when you had through your relationship, you got to know him on a fairly intimate level, like you said. What would you say was the defining character trait of the man? Resilience,
indestructibility, perseverance. I mean, this is a man who never gave up his dream of being president, who came back from adversity. First of all, who rose from dirt, who rose from very humble roots, a man who was handed nothing in his life, unlike, say, Jack Kennedy, who was pretty much handed anything. When Nixon read a speech, he wrote that speech. When John Kennedy read a speech, Ted Sorensen wrote that speech. In most cases, probably the first time Kennedy was reading it. He was, he was indestructible. I mean, look, I have a tattoo of Nixon on my back. It's about the size of a grapefruit. It's like a floating head between my shoulder blades. It's not an ideological statement. it's a daily reminder that in life, when you face defeats, when you face setbacks, when things don't go your way, you have an obligation to get yourself up off the mat, dust yourself off, and get back in the game. I think it was Nixon who said, a man is not finished when he is defeated. He's only finished when he quits.
Mm-hmm. Well, then he must have hated to resign the presidency then. That must have just really shaken him to the core.
Well, I think, as he said in his resignation speech, it violated every fiber in his body, but at the same time, he didn't stop serving his country just because he resigned. He wrote 10 best-selling books on foreign policy, and late in his life, he emerges as a key foreign policy advisor for President Bill Clinton at a time that the Soviet Union is blowing up and that the Chinese are growing in strength. So I would argue that he survives once again, even post-pardon, to serve his country.
Yeah, after that, I would feel like his efforts all of a sudden got channeled into the rehabilitation to convince the country that I'm really not such a bad guy. And
throughout his entire career, his expertise in foreign affairs and the fact that, in 8 years as vice president, he visited virtually every major country, and he had personal relationships with most of the world leaders, through the most important part of the 20th century, was his strong suit. That was his calling card, and he used it to make his comeback in 1968. It was the argument for his candidacy in 1960 over Kennedy. He used it to make his comeback in 1968, and he ultimately uses it to make his final comeback, where even Bill Clinton says at Nixon's funeral, let the days of judging Richard Nixon on anything less than his entire record be over.
And the unheralded late-night phone calls that we didn't find out about until years later. In those days, Clinton didn't necessarily wear it on his sleeve that he was consulting with Mr. Nixon. But I wanted to tell you real quickly, your story of ending up sitting with him for 4 hours is a kind of a story that I've heard before. Our long-term congressman from here in Orlando, a guy named Bill McCollum, who was also Florida's Attorney General, happened to be in New York, some business at the United Nations. Mr. Nixon was in New York, summoned McCollum to come and see him on ostensibly a 15-minute visit. And as Bill tells the story, they sat for 4 hours into the wee hours of the morning, and it was one of the most enlightening conversations on foreign policy that McCollum said he ever had.
Well, when I met him in San Clemente, it was 1979, and I think the conversation lasted as long as it did because he asserted that he thought former Texas Governor John Connally would be the Republican nominee for president in 1980, and I said, no, Mr. President, you're wrong. We're going to nominate Ronald Reagan. So he liked being challenged. He liked, he wasn't interested in yes men at that point. I think he'd had enough of those. He was interested in a provocative argument, but he had an encyclopedic knowledge of politics and congressional districts and House members, and he was very forward-looking. It was very difficult to get him to be retrospective or introspective. Now, it is true that when he had a couple cocktails, and I drank with him on numerous occasions, he would become more loquacious. And it was that point you could get him to talk about Eisenhower and Dewey and the vice presidency and the 1960 campaign in the past. But generally speaking, he really wanted to know more about tomorrow. Who were the up-and-coming leaders in politics? Who were the most impressive of the Democrats, etc.?
And he liked his silver bullets, I think he called them.
Yes.
And but as you say, his knowledge of the Congress was encyclopedic, and that was a part of the 1968 rehabilitation. His ability to get out there and help. In 1966 as well. Anybody who needed something from Republican leadership, he was there.
Well, I think that the pivotal decision that he makes is in 1964 when the party nominates Goldwater and Rockefeller and Romney and Scranton all take a walk. And Nixon does not take a walk. In fact, Nixon makes more campaign appearances on behalf of Barry Goldwater than Barry Goldwater makes on behalf of himself. And that is the beginning of Nixon nailing down the right flank of the party, then the ascendant wing of the party. and really becomes the anchor for his renomination in 1968, although, I mean, there's an extraordinary confluence of events, starting with the assassination of John Kennedy, which has the inadvertent result of breathing life back into the political prospects of a finished Richard Nixon. The Vietnam War, the murder of Dr. King, the murder of Robert Kennedy, all these things clear a path for the greatest comeback in American political history.
I'd like to take it back to 1960. Let's start the story there. So Nixon is running against Kennedy, and Kennedy wins by a squeaker. But there was some unusual doings in Texas and Illinois. Let's talk a little about that.
Yeah, in my book, Nixon's Secrets, which is out now, I really devote a lot of time to recasting the 1960 election. The narrative that was written by Theodore H. White, The Making of the President in 1960, which really changed the whole face of how political reporting on presidential campaigns was done in this country, is a romantic fiction. The problem is it's just not true. I mean, yeah, there were dirty tactics. The Kennedys wiretapped Nixon's hotel suite at the Sheridan Ward Park on the night before the second Nixon-Kennedy debate. The Kennedys broke into Nixon's doctor's office in New York City to steal his medical records. The Kennedys broke into Nixon's accountant's office in Los Angeles to steal his financial records. The Kennedys wiretapped the Republican National Committee. This is all documented in my book. So Watergate happened 12 years before Watergate. This is all 12 years before Watergate. But now you understand Nixon's mentality in 1972. As he says, you can hear him say in the tapes, hell, everybody bugs everybody. We know that. But the idea that the Kennedys were white hat wearing, knights, dashing intellectual sophisticates, and Nixon was a black-hatted villain is just not true. And although it is true that Nixon made really major mistakes in the beginning of the 1960 campaign, the first mistake being a pledge to visit all 50 states, which meant that instead of focusing in the Big Ten swing states that would decide the election, he was stuck visiting states like Wyoming and Wyoming and Alaska, which he already had locked up. And then, of course, the decision to debate Kennedy at all, who is far less well-known, elevates Kennedy to the same stature as a sitting vice president, so that was an error, compounded by the fact that Nixon bumps his knee on a car door 2 weeks before the debate and is hospitalized after Labor Day. So he shows up in Chicago, still running a fever, still on antibiotics, 15 pounds underweight. He stops along the way to visit 5 states on his way to Chicago, trying to make up lost ground. Meanwhile, Kennedy gets to Chicago early. He spends the day getting a suntan on the roof of the hotel with 2 hookers. And Nixon makes a fundamental mistake, thinking that the substance of the debate is what will be important, as opposed to his appearance in the debate, his style in the debate.
Roger, I tell you what, hold that. We'll come back and let you finish up that thought, but we do need to take a little bit of a pause along our network line here. We have to remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And visiting with us from Fort Lauderdale today is Roger Stone. His brand new book, Nixon's Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About President Watergate and the Pardon. And we'll continue our conversation following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tuff TV 38. That's TUFF TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, Roger Stone, a long-time Politico on the national scene. He's got a brand new book entitled Nixon's Secrets. It's from Skyhorse Publishing, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. And Roger, we presume that the book is available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com.
Absolutely. You can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com, and it is readily available and doing pretty well.
All right. Well, as we came down to the end of that previous segment, we were talking about 1960 and all the problems that Mr. Nixon had, and I wanted to go back and let you finish up that thought.
So the first debate is a disaster, but what the historians failed to tell you is that there were 4 debates, not one, and that while it is true that the size of the television debate in debates for debates 2 and 3 are smaller than the first, the 4th debate has a TV audience that is virtually as big as the first debate, and it is considered Nixon's strongest of the 4 debates. Also, Eisenhower comes off the bench and campaigns for Nixon in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles, draws enormous crowds, and really laces into Kennedy in an uncharacteristic way, because Eisenhower was generally pretty non-political. And Nixon closes fast. In fact, I think he won the election. I go to great detail in my book to detail the voter fraud, both in Chicago on behalf of the Daily Machine and the mob, which was intimidating votes on behalf of John Kennedy, in an unholy deal with Kennedy's father, Ambassador Joe Kennedy, and more precisely in Texas, where Lyndon Johnson's stealing is even more outrageous. The Kennedy-Johnson ticket only carries Texas by 46,000 votes, and the Johnson machine throws out 56,000 Nixon Lodge ballots in Dallas County alone, because the voters made the mistake of circling Nixon Lodge as opposed to crossing out all the names of the candidates that you weren't for, which is an odd way to vote.
So, in other words, Kennedy was smart to pick Johnson for the win, but then dumb to pick Johnson because then Johnson rubbed out Kennedy. So,
yeah, no, I think in the end, I think Johnson blackmailed his way onto the ticket. It turned out to be right in terms of winning the election, but in my previous book, I laid out the fact that I think Lyndon Johnson engineered the murder of John Kennedy because he was facing federal prosecution at Robert Kennedy's hands.
Now let's skip ahead to the comeback of '68. How did Nixon do it? You know, he said you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore after he lost the governor's race. What was that? 1962, I believe.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, of course, it's only a space of 6 years. In other words, from the time that Nixon's first elected to Congress, 1946, to the time he becomes vice president, is only a 6-year span. A meteoric rise. In 1962, he essentially burns out of politics entirely, putting it all on the line to run for governor of California in an effort to keep his political prospects to become president alive. He loses, largely because the Cuban Missile Crisis comes down 2 weeks before the election, and there's an immediate rally to the party of the sitting president, John Kennedy. And then he painstakingly fights his way back from the wilderness. As I mentioned earlier, campaigning for Goldwater is a central part of that. But Nixon, who had really been a centrist and who in 1964 had maneuvered behind the scenes to try to block Goldwater, attends the convention and sees graphically that the party has shifted to the right. And Nixon decides that it's time to shift right along with them. So he not only campaigns for Goldwater in '64, but he goes on the road in '66 on behalf of congressional candidates, and he sees the conservative revolution at the grassroots of the party, and therefore he nails down Strom Thurmond, Barry Goldwater, John Tower, Bill Buckley, all of the leaders of the Goldwater wing of the party. He nails them down early, and he ultimately gets renominated and then squeaks out another close election. People don't realize this, but Nixon's margin over Humphrey was closer than Kennedy's margin over Nixon 8 years previously.
No, most people don't know that. That's true.
Election night in '68 is another one of those nights when we sat in the newsroom until 6 o'clock in the morning and the next day, and nobody knew who was going to win yet.
It had to be a real nail biter for the Nixons.
Yeah.
What were you, like 15 back then, Reagan? Jeez. So let's skip ahead to the break-in. This is, of course, the 40th anniversary of the resignation. 2 years prior, we had the break-in during the 72 campaign. What was the purpose of the break-in? Who orchestrated it? I had read a theory once that it was a coup by the CIA because Nixon kept asking about the Bay of Pigs thing, which was code for the Kennedy assassination files, and so the CIA had it in for him to get rid of him because they didn't want those files seeing the light of day. That was one book that postulated that.
Yeah, I think that's partially correct, but I think their opposition was even deeper. The CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the Army Intelligence were deeply opposed to détente. They thought with the election of Nixon they were getting a super hardliner. So when he began withdrawing troops from Vietnam, they were in shock, particularly since he was withdrawing at a much faster rate than the Pentagon thought wise. Then the opening to China shocked them. And lastly, they were adamantly opposed to the SALT agreements, the arms control agreements that Nixon won from the Russians. So the animosity from the Central Intelligence Agency, exacerbated by Nixon's attempts to get control of the Kennedy assassination records, made him an enemy. I detail in the book that I think the Central Intelligence Agency tried twice to assassinate Nixon in 1972. 2 separate plots, both of them centered here in Florida. The first one was an attempt to infiltrate a Vietnam Veterans Against the War demonstration outside Nixon's compound in Key Biscayne and use a shoulder-launched rocket to kill Nixon in his living room. And then when that collapsed, they actually hired a CIA contract killer named Ed Kaiser, supplied Kaiser with a weapon, and told him only at the last minute that the target was Nixon, in which case he backed out and the plot resigned. So I believe Senator Howard Baker really stumbled on this in the Senate Watergate investigation by the Senate, that the CIA's fingerprints were all over the break-in, meaning they infiltrated and sabotaged the burglar team, taking advantage of the stupidity of some of Nixon's men and even contemplating breaking in, but purposely undermined the operation to ensure that the Nixon men were caught. But there's another side of this, and that is, I believe, and I write this in the book, that the guy who planned and pushed and covered up the break-in was none other than John W. Dean. 2 of the investigators who worked for Dean, both former decorated New York City cops, write in their individual memoirs that Dean had them case out the Watergate 6 weeks before the first break-in. So and James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, tells the grand jury that it was Dean who was the mastermind of the break-in.
Well, what's Dean's motivation?
Dean's motivation is he wants the records of a call girl ring that is being utilized by the Democratic National Committee that is 3 blocks from the Watergate, operating out of the Columbia Plaza apartments. He either wants this information for blackmail, that's one theory, or he wants it because his wife, then his girlfriend, is one of the girls working for the call girl ring. And there is evidence, there's a portfolio and a desk drawer at the Democratic National Committee where visiting out-of-town Democrats can kind of look at the talent and choose their escort. One of the Watergate burglars, Eugenio Martinez, 92 years old, still alive, interviewed for my book, was arrested with the key to the desk drawer where the portfolio was kept.
Wow.
So, in other words, John Dean had this scheme to break into the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, in order to get a book about the call girls. And the CIA knew that this was going down and decided to botch the operation in order to get rid of Nixon. That's the basic postulation.
Could not have said it better myself.
Oh, you can't make this stuff up, Roger. you really can't, man. So here's another interesting wrinkle before we go to break, that you say that Al Haig orchestrated Nixon's removal from office also. And also brokered a deal for his pardon. Let's talk about that angle real quick.
I think Haig's real loyalty is to the Joint Chiefs. Haig is a military man, career military man. First of all, he's the guy who plans the Bay of Pigs for the CIA, so he has got a CIA background himself. Alexander Butterfield, who is a deputy to Haig, is also a CIA operative running the operations in Australia prior to attaching himself to the Nixon White House. And there's a number of actions by Haig after he becomes Nixon's chief of staff, which cannot be coincidental, but none of them are in Nixon's interest.
All right, so we'll pick up that line when we come back.
We do have to hold the thought there. Remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Roger Stone. His brand new book, Nixon's Secrets, from Skyhorse Publishing. It is available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. The rise, fall, and untold truth about the president, Watergate, the pardon, and we'll continue in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest, Roger Stone, his new book from Skyhorse Publishing, Nixon's Secrets. Roger served with the committee to re-elect the president and in the administration. Later on for Ronald Reagan, he's been around Washington politics these many years. And Roger, thank you for spending all this time with us today. We were talking there as we ended that last segment about Alexander Haig and his role as we got into the Watergate brouhaha.
Yeah, Haig really takes firm control as Nixon's chief of staff after Nixon is required to fire Bob Haldeman. And he makes a series of quote-unquote mistakes that really cannot be explained. For example, Haig learns that the Senate Watergate Committee has learned about the taping system. He learns this on a Friday. He knows that Alexander Butterfield, one of Nixon's deputies, will be subpoenaed to appear Monday morning. Nixon has Saturday and Sunday in which to destroy the tapes before they're subpoenaed, because they are at that juncture his personal property, and without a subpoena, destruction of the tapes would not be a crime. But Haig never tells Nixon that the jig is up and that the tapes have been discovered. Nixon learns it on television Monday morning. There's mistake number one. Nixon decides to fire Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox because of his insistence on turning over the tapes. Nixon assigns Haig to go talk to Attorney General Elliot Richardson to determine what Richardson will do if he fires Cox. And Haig reports to Nixon that Richardson will stick. In fact, Richardson told Haig the exact opposite. If you fire Cox, I won't give the order, I will have to resign. That's strike two. And then lastly is the famous 18-and-a-half-minute gap. Now, there's no question, if you listen to the tape, the first 5 minutes were erased by Nixon's longtime secretary, Rosemary Woods. There's a loud 5-minute buzz. And then there are two subsequent erasures that total another 13.5 minutes. Those erasures happen during the time that the tapes are in the custody of General Alexander Haig. And we know from Bob Woodward's book, All the President Men, that Deep Throat calls Woodward and says, tell the Senate Watergate Committee to ask about whether there's a taping system because there's a deliberate erasure in the tapes. So I think Haig sets Nixon up for the fall. I think his real loyalty is to the Joint Chiefs. Nixon never believed this because Haig was an extraordinary courtier. I mean, he was a brown-noser par excellence, and I think he fooled Nixon right to the bitter end.
Well, and then you skip ahead forward briefly, and Reagan is shot, and Al Haig says, I'm in charge. So, I guess that was just his mentality. What was in your conversations with Richard Nixon, what was his take on the setup and being set up, and what was his feelings regarding all this?
I think he figured out the CIA role in his takedown after the fact. On the other hand, it was very hard to get him to talk again, retrospectively. I mean, Haig's greatest role, of course, is in the pardon. I'm convinced that Agnew is moved out of the way. He's completely set up. Ultimately, Agnew, the vice president, only cops to a very minor tax charge, and Gerald Ford is maneuvered into place. Why Ford? Because Nixon knows in real time that as a congressman and a member of the Warren Commission, it is Gerald Ford who alters the autopsy of John Kennedy to move the description of the wound in his upper left back to the lower neck in order to accommodate the government's single bullet theory. Now, the American people don't learn about this alteration for another 30 years, when the Assassinations Record Review Board declassifies the Kennedy autopsy. Ford's handwriting is found. The New York Times reports it. Associated Press reports it. But in 1973, Nixon already knows it, and Nixon dispatches Haig to tell Gerald Ford, look, if Nixon goes to trial, he's taking everybody down with him, including you, Jerry. He knows what you did to the autopsy. He knows what really happened in Dallas, which is why after August 1st, when Haig meets privately with Vice President Ford, it's very clear that Ford has decided to pardon Nixon at his own political peril. From that time forward, the handwriting is on the wall. So I think Nixon had Ford by the short hairs. That's why he wanted him for vice president. That was his insurance policy.
Absolutely incredible. I tell you what, the clock has run by on us much too fast here, Roger, and I know that you're going to be in the Orlando area here a couple of weeks down the road. We would like you to come back if we can arrange this and get you to sit in the studio with us, and we'll spend some more time uncovering these secrets and teasing the folks with what is in this book a little bit, and more of his final recovery that leads up to the time of his death. So, again, the book is Nixon's Secrets, The Rise, Fall, and Untold Truth About the President, Watergate, and the Pardon. It is by Roger Stone. He is a Fort Lauderdale resident and lifetime political raconteur. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll have a closing thought in a moment. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tuff TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And a pleasure to have Roger Stone with us again, as you have mentioned. And hopefully we get him back here and we'll go more in depth onto this book in a couple of weeks from now.
You know, a lot of people write a lot of books about these subjects, but Roger Stone's...
He was there.
He was there, and his stuff always seems to check out. And that's important when you're trying to decipher truth from fiction. And as messy as truth is, Roger Stone's, what he puts forth and postulates is a lot more compelling and interesting than the narrative that we're always hearing.
Well, yes, and he spends a great deal of time doing the research that has been done by respected historians and backs up his charges.
Yeah, so it's I've learned something today, Reagan, haven't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and boy, there's a lot in this book. Wow.
You see, in life, folks, there's no black and white. Everything is gray.
That's right.
Everybody wants to put a white hat on Kennedy and a black hat on Nixon. It's true.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But they were both gray hats. Gray hats.
Yeah.
Here's you wanted to tell us a story.
I do. Back at the Daytona 500,
right?
Charlie Crist was going to have one of the cars with his name on it, and promoting him for governor. And at the very last minute, it was yanked. I mean, the arrangements were made, the money was agreed upon, and it was canceled. It seems that the company that owns the racing group that this car belonged to is the president of the company is a fellow by the name of Mike Curb. And if you're old enough, you may remember a couple of minor hit records, the Mike Curb Congregation back in the 70s. And Mike Curb, it turns out, was the Republican lieutenant governor of California under Ronald Reagan. And when he found out Charlie Crist wanted to be on his race car, he said, absolutely not.
There's not enough money in the world, huh?
No.
Usually those guys are a little more pragmatic, Reagan, when it comes to the dollar signs.
Well, that's a story you're probably not going to hear anywhere else.
That's a great story.
Along, yeah.
Also, it seems like the commotion over Common Core had died down in Florida, but a dust-up last month in Lee County in the school system, which is the state's 9th largest district, 85,000 students, reignited the debate over the controversial education benchmarks, put the issue front and center in the governor's race. Observers say it could present a challenge for GOP Governor Rick Scott to win. Scott must rally an active and vocal part of his base, Tea Party members who want to eviscerate the new standards, but he's also vying for votes from moderate GOPers who support the Common Core standards. And he's keenly aware that Jeb Bush has been a powerful driving force behind the standards' success. So, Crist has embraced Common Core, but is less likely to face pushback for his position. It's interesting how that's playing out.
Yeah. Well, and it's going to continue to be controversial and a major issue for Jeb Bush, no matter what he does. He spent an awful lot of his time since leaving the governorship dedicating, he tells us, his life to education.
Absolutely.
So, well, it is time for us to sort of call it quits for this week. We do want to say thank you for your time and invite you to send your comments to us via email or Twitter or whatever you want. Visit the website and let us know what you think. If you have somebody you want to hear on the Florida Roundtable, we're hopeful of getting Roger Stone back here in person in just a couple of weeks. So, again, the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.